So this is Uriah from the Philadelphia Writers Conference, and today we have a groundbreaking opportunity. This is our first vlog that will be uploaded onto our recently created YouTube page, and we're going to spread it across social media. And what we're trying to do with the Philadelphia Writers Conference is to not only promote this great event where we have writers from all over the region in Philadelphia come to Center City in June every year. We have this great event that we're trying to promote, and we also want to promote writing itself, the variety of genres that we have people attending and really involved with their craft. And we want to diversify the content a little bit. Last year we did some audio podcasts, but this year we said, let's do some vlogs, and we'll get on Skype and we'll invite some unique guests. And today our first guest is a poet, an educator, and he's become a pretty good friend of mine. Today we have Brian Fanelli, who is an educator at Lackawanna College, a professor, and he's also a poet and a writer. His recent book, Waiting for the Dead to Speak, here's the cover. I read it, and he has quite a few poems that we'll touch on today. And also in his background, Brian is also a former political journalist. So officially, Brian, welcome. It's good to see you, my friend.
Thank you. It's good to see you as well. Thank you for giving me this opportunity, and I'm so glad too that you're helping out with the Philadelphia Writers Conference, because that is a wonderful event for the Pennsylvania literary community.
Yeah, I know that you're up in not Harrisburg. You're up Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. You are
Scranton area.
Scranton area.
I don't
Okay.
know. Yes.
Yeah, you survived the great storm last night, barely though, right?
Barely. Yes. We've been getting all this rain. I mean, we had Stella, and then we had constant rainstorms. But I'm still here, and you're still here, and we get to talk about writing, so that's good.
Awesome. So let's get right to it, Brian. The first question has to do with your recent book, and I know for you to not only produce so many poems and then bring it all together to put it into a book, there's the publishing aspect, there's the promotional aspect. So if you could just elaborate on what that experience has been like with waiting for the dead to speak.
Well, it's been great. The book's been out for 6 or 7 months now. When it first came out, those first few months, I was on the road every weekend. I've done a lot of readings for this book so far, everywhere from Boston to New York to Harrisburg to Lancaster to New Jersey, really around all the Northeast United States. Relying on connections that I've made over the years, and it's been wonderful. I mean, I love going into different communities and talking poetry, talking writing, sharing poems. So yeah, it's been a great experience. Even though these poems are narrative and they tell a story, I do think it's a lot different than my last book, All That Remains. I think that the content is a lot different. This book took longer to write. It took a few more years to write, and I really took my time with it, and I think that I grew through this whole process, through the content that I've written and through the different forms that I tried for this collection. So it's been wonderful all around.
Awesome. Speaking of your former book, All That Remains, I also read that book. You had some great pieces in there. A lot of it was touching to the heart. And what people may not know about that book, All That Remains, is it was dedicated to your father. And we've talked several times in the past, and you had a very special relationship with him. This book, this recent book that you wrote, it was published, and you decided to dedicate it to all of your former teachers and maybe even some current teachers. Tell us about that dedication.
Well, when I finished the manuscript and I was putting this together for New York Quarterly Books, I was just finishing my PhD, and it was this moment where I thought, wow, I'm finally done. I'm finally done with school after all these years. And I just was meditating on and thinking about all these different teachers that I had over the years, going back to high school, including the ones that introduced me to my first favorite poets, and then really encouraged me to go into writing, all the way up to the folks that were on my dissertation committee, and encouraged me to keep writing and keep teaching. And to paraphrase, T.S. Eliot's essay, Tradition, the Individual Talent, if you're going to be a poet or any writer, I don't think this is just true for poets, but any art form, any form of writing, you got to understand the tradition that you're part of and the writers and the thinkers that came before you, because you're part of that tradition. So you can't break rules in writing. You can't do something new and innovative if you don't know what came before you. So I also had that idea in mind, that with poetry especially, you're part of this long tradition going back to the ancient Greek poets and the oral tradition. And you're part of that. That should be in your DNA. So they're your teachers as well.
That's fantastic. I think everybody, I mean, I've been in education for 15 years now, and you watch TV and you watch interviews of people that have done fantastic things, people who have gone on to achieve success in an array of fields, and they all have a story about a former teacher, whether it was college, which is what you do as a professor, or middle school or high school. I mean, I think paying homage and respect to your teachers, I think that was a very noble thing of you to do, and I'm sure they appreciate it. Let's get to more particularly the content of your book. You have dozens of poems in your poetry book. A few of them stood out to me, but let's start with you in terms of which poems from this recent book stand out to you. Maybe give me one or two, and tell us why.
There's a poem in the book. It's actually one of the oldest in the book. It's called Writing the Last Word. And though I mostly covered local and state politics as a reporter, for a while at that job, I was the only reporter who worked on Saturday, because I was the new guy and I was the little cub reporter just out of college. And so I was the only one who had to work on Saturdays, along with one or two editors. And if something happened, you had to go cover it. So there was a homicide that happened in Coatesville, actually. I was living in the Philly area at the time. And I had to go to that, and this guy had just been shot outside of his house. And, I had to actually talk to his family, because when something's under investigation, police aren't really going to give you details. So if you want to get a story, you have to talk to neighbors. And if the family's willing to talk to you, you have to talk to the family. And I didn't write anything poetry-wise or fiction-wise about that incident. Took quite a while, almost 10 years, till I went back and I wrote a poem about it, and it is one of the first poems that ended up in this book. So it's an older poem, but it's also one that took a long time to process and kind of generate as I thought about that day and the difficulty of having to talk to this guy's wife, who's grieving. And what this guy's story might have been, and what you're going to put in your story as a news reporter that's accurate. So I like that one. And then I also like some of the poems in the last section about nature. They're kind of these pastoral poems, like Facing Late Autumn and Learning to Garden. I think that those poems sort of marked the shift for me in terms of what I started to write about and being more conscious of the environment around me, the greater environment. So I like some of those poems a lot as well.
Tell us a little bit about the first poem. I mean, it reached out and grabbed me because the topic had to do with bullying. And I think a lot of young people, especially high schoolers and maybe even college kids who watch this conversation between us, tell us about that poem. The title is, just go back into the book. It's an interesting title. For Jimmy, who bruised my ribs and busted my nose. Tell us about that poem.
Well, that title always gets a lot of laughs if I introduce it at a reading. That poem's semi-autobiographical, but not fully. When I was growing up, I was 10 or 11, and there was this bully in the neighborhood named Jimmy. We did call him Fat Jimmy. I don't recommend calling anybody fat, but that's the nickname that we gave him. And he was just this big, stocky kid who would literally just pummel people over stupid things. And I got in a fight with him. I don't remember why, but he did bust my nose, and I was bleeding, and I got a swollen eye from it, and got clocked a few times. And And I think I tried to punch him back, but it didn't matter because I was like this scrawny kid and it didn't matter. Um, and then he just left. I mean, he just left and I was on the ground. I remember he broke my glasses. I remember that too. But in the poem, I didn't want it to be a cliche, typical bully type of poem. So I wanted to humanize this character in the poem. And at the end of the poem, the last two lines, the bully extends his hand to the speaker after he realizes what he's done after looking at the speaker's blood on his hand. So poetry, I think, needs to take a turn line from line, and I wanted to try to make the poem do something unexpected and not have this kind of stock character in it.
Yeah, I think when it comes to expression, young people these days, they're being pulled in a million and one different directions. And I know
Mhm.
firsthand, some of these students don't know how to channel certain emotions. And I
Mhm.
think your poem about bullying, and I read it to my students today, and they were amazed at, the ending, which you said earlier, you had to humanize it a little bit. You didn't want it to be cliche, but I think a lot of people can relate to that. And poetry is a great way to get some of those feelings out on paper, and it's in a more, of course, reflective manner, but it's definitely better than the alternative of lashing out against people and doing things that are counterproductive. So my next question is, we're going to move along to the fourth question on my list. It has to do with advice. I've been to quite a few writing conferences. I'm sure you have yourself.
Mhm.
And poetry is probably not the easiest kind of book to get published. But clearly you've pretty much overcome that obstacle. You're just that good, right? So my question to you is, if you were to speak to someone who loves poetry, I mean, they're enamored with the process, the style, and the opportunities through it to expression, for someone who wants to maybe do what you did, which is get several books published of poetry, what advice would you give them, Brian?
Well, number one, don't think you're going to make any money in this, right?
Okay.
So that's my first piece of advice.
Limited money check.
Limited money. And I think don't rush to get a book published. Make sure that the poems in it cohere, that they speak to each other, that they're not all the same, but at the same time that they also work well together and work together back to back. I think that that's important. And just read as much as possible. And don't just read poets writing today. Go back to Homer, go back to Shakespeare, go back to William Blake, go back to Emily Dickinson and Walt Whitman. And as I said earlier, learn the tradition that you're part of. Try to write in different forms. Writing in different forms in any genre, not just poetry, is going to open you up intellectually and challenge you. It might be a bad poem or a bad piece of prose, but at least you tried something different and you might be able to salvage a few of those lines. So write in different forms. Work and read as much as possible. Try to set a habit of writing, even if it's only for 10 to 20 minutes a day. Make a commitment and do that. And with poetry, support the community. Poetry is a unique animal because it is a really very, very tight-knit community, and a lot of poets know each other on the sort of broader national level. So, start something in your own community. Start a reading series. Invite local writers and writers from out of the area. Host a community workshop. Get to know people. Put yourself out there. But that is so important for poetry because poetry readings are just, with the age we live in, poetry readings are a quintessential part of the genre. And if you do get a book out there, expect to do readings because nobody's going to buy the book otherwise. That's just the age that we're living in. So be willing to put yourself out there, practice reading, do things in your community. As I said, start a poetry series, start a community workshop group. Give back to the community that you want to be part of or that you are currently part of. I think that that's so important, especially in the poetry world.
That's how we met, Brian, at the 100,000 Poets for Change, and I usually see you there every year. I didn't see you this year. I think we were at different times, but yeah, giving back to the community and adding value to that community. I think that a lot of writers can attest to that, and I
Mhm.
definitely think that's good advice. So the last question, Brian, has to do with what you have coming down the road. I'm sure you have a lot of great, interesting events that you're going to be either hosting or reading. So why don't you give all the viewers an opportunity to know what's coming down the road for you?
Well, April 29th, speaking of the local community, I host a reading series with my friend Dawn Lees called the Writer's Showcase. And April 29th at 7 p.m., we are going to host 5 local and regional writers. We have some fiction writers and we have 3 poets, I believe. So they're going to take the stage at the Old Brick Theater in Scranton. I'm really excited to host them. Some of them will be reading here for the first time, so I'm stoked to have them. Then in June, I am partaking in a writers' conference in the Poconos. And I'm going to be on a panel just about the poetry genre, getting started, going to give some different writing prompts. So I'm looking forward to that. Then I've also been, working on some different essays. I like to challenge myself and I like to write in different genres, even though poetry is my main genre. So I'm working on some different essays now for some different publications as well as some book reviews because I like to write in prose as well as poetry. So that's what I have going on. And I hope to get to the Philadelphia Writers Conference as well. Since I'm not too far from that, and it is one of the best conferences in, I think, our state. So that's what I got going on over the next few months.
And we would love to have you, Brian. I'm looking forward to you attending one of these years, one of these opportunities that are coming down your way. And speaking of the Philadelphia Writers Conference, on behalf of the conference, I want to thank you for being a guest today and fighting through the storm and getting back online so we could have this conversation. Thank you, Brian.
It was great talking to you. Thank you for interviewing me. I really appreciate it. And the Philadelphia Writers Conference, I want to give a shout out and a thank you to them as well.
Always a pleasure, my friend. So with that being said, if you don't know, the Philadelphia Writers Conference is coming up this June 9th, 10th, and 11th. It's in historic Philadelphia at the Wyndham Hotel. It's not too late to register. As a matter of fact, if you register before a particular date, you can get a discount. Now, how do you register? For the Philadelphia Writers Conference, this is Uriah Young with Brian Fanelli. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next time. Thanks.